Welcome to this special edition of Made in Europe, or Made in Europe meets EMSNOW on tour. I'm joined by Eric Miscoll of EMSNOW and Dieter Weiss of Informa. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Now, I know you're not too far away, but I know you're in separate rooms. Is that because you spent so long with each other, you can't bear to be in the same space anymore?
Well, it's good that he is in another room.
Okay, enough said.
After 3 weeks, we're an old married couple at this point.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, absolutely. And I've enjoyed the photos, not just from the factories, but from the excursions you've had at the weekends and all the fun you've been having. Eric, perhaps you can start by just giving us a bit of an overview of what you've been doing over there in Europe.
Yeah, so I have been here going on 3 weeks. I fly home tomorrow, assuming I can pass my COVID test later today. Otherwise, I'm here for Christmas, Dieter. Listen, so far, since we got here, we've touched 6 countries. I asked Dieter yesterday, he's been driving us and everything. We've traveled, I think it's 3,136 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
We've toured 13 facilities directly. We attended an event in Tallinn, Estonia, that was co-hosted by the IPC and the Estonian Electronic Industry Association, and got to meet with representatives of many other EMS and some supplier companies there. We toured the ASM competency facility in Munich. That was quite impressive. We've stayed at 5 hotels, I think. We've, in addition to Dieter's magnificent home here in Oberstdorf that served as our headquarters for most of this. Mm-hmm. And honestly, when I leave tomorrow, I'm not sure what I'm going to miss more, Dieter or this magnificent view out here. It's spectacular. So yeah, that's in a nutshell is what we've been doing.
Yeah, good times, and you know, exploring lots of what's going on in the EMS industry. And Dieter, these are all companies you set up all these appointments. But was there anything for you that you were really excited to see that you hadn't seen before? I think I listened to your podcast on the Zollner tour, and I think it was the first time you'd been able to visit that factory. What were the highlights for you?
Well, number one is the majority of my business is sitting at the computer, having video conferences and telephone calls, because at the end of the day, it's simply not possible to visit nearly 2,200 EMS companies in Europe. So, and I only can apologize to everybody whom we haven't met this time, and I hope you understand that it's just not possible. We would have loved to see many more companies, because I think there are many more companies out there in Europe who are very interesting. In actual fact, we even wanted to go to the Netherlands yesterday, which was on short notice cancelled due to the COVID situation in the Netherlands. So I did give a presentation to the Dutch Electronics Association, FHI, in the Netherlands yesterday afternoon with a video conference. Now, coming back to your question, I have seen some of the factories before, but believe it or not, even so, I have been so many times at company Zollner, the biggest German and European customer. We never had a chance to visit manufacturing. We were sitting in the meeting room all day discussing important topics. So this time we took the chance and toured the factory, and I can tell you that was very, very impressive. But again, It was not the only thing that was impressive. If I, for example, and sorry, I cannot mention all of them, but for example, in Estonia, we visited the mechanical factory of Antigen. And that was due to the high degree of automation, the complexity, and all the different things they did over there, to me was fairly new. And was impressive. whereas all the other factories, we in the majority saw many assembly lines. The only interesting point there, out of the 13 assembly lines, out of the 13 companies we saw over there, about 70% of them were using ASM equipment, which I had not known so far that they were so dominant in the market. But that was, you learn something new every day.
Yeah, every day is a school day, Dieter. And Eric, you actually went to Munich and visited the ASM, is it Center of Competence or Center of Excellence they have down there?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, and you get to see the lines laid out. You get to see the, and what I like is they can bring customers in. You can not just check the equipment, they can actually bring in kits and samples down there. They can see how that can work. And within that, ASM doesn't just have their own machines. They also have those of various partner companies too, within the ecosystem to kind of build that. So truly a very impressive facility.
Yeah, almost like a permanent exhibit. And to what Dieter was saying, I think, Eric, when you walk the factory floor with the chief operating officer or the head of operations, you get to know a business in a very intimate way, in quite a different way to what you would normally do just through, interviews or discussions in meeting rooms or at trade shows.
No, precisely right. Hey, listen, before we jump into more detail, I do want to make a comment about the whole COVID thing here, because I think that, that has been, we're going around, we're seeing the trends, but we're also living within this time of a pandemic and so, I mean, we've been tested now 8 times, right? So we will be tested again today, mostly so and Dieter is getting tested again too. Every company we went into we had to check in, we had to provide our vaccination records. Fortunately, Dieter and I had both had all 3 vaccinations. So, but it's just a checking in. There's nothing inconvenient about it, right? We wear masks everywhere, but then once you're in the conference room, you ask permission and most people take them off and you sit down. But then when you're, just like going to restaurants, right? You put them on when you're moving around, you take it off when you're sitting down.
And not to forget to mention that at 2 factories, we were tested on-site by their own employees.
Yeah. No, so you have the rapid antigen test. Yeah.
Right. And those, are good for 24 hours. So then, because we were day to day, last week was just day after day, 2 companies a day. So that was very cool. I will say, Dieter also convinced me that there's a local elixir here that kind of helps against the COVID bug that's derived from the oldest industry standard in the world, the Einheitsgebot, which is that it's the brewing of beer since 1516, is it, Dieter?
Yeah.
So that helped.
Helping.
He always said you have to kill the germs in your throat. So we did that.
That's a smart way of doing that. And Eric, well done for going. Well done for getting out there, because at the moment I'm seeing so many people kind of jostling with whether they're going to go through with their travel plans, whether they can come to Apex, whether they can do different things in Europe. A colleague of mine was leaving Singapore tomorrow to go to Italy and was told today that Italy was no longer welcoming people from Singapore. So he's had to divert to Paris. So yeah, life is complicated in terms of travel at the moment. So well done for getting out there. And also, guys, well done for the podcasts, because you guys have really hit the ground running with your podcasts. Every day, more people are downloading them. I'm getting feedback on LinkedIn and comments about them. So rest assured, you're not just talking to yourselves. People are listening to you out there. I wanted to dig in. Yeah, I wanted to dig in some of the topics that come up on there. And, there's a couple of major ones. Obviously, shortages is huge, and that's twofold. That's one in terms of the material supply chain, but also in terms of labor. Let's tackle the material supply chain first. We've talked about this a lot, and you might just say to me, hey, I've got nothing new to add. It's hard, and we're all doing our best, and we don't know when it's going away. But how are people feeling about it on the ground? Is it still a huge point of stress?
It's the number one issue, right? It absolutely is. And I can't tell you, several companies mentioned that, they'd be doing more revenues if they could just get parts.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The work is there, the parts are not there. It's number one is truly the semiconductors, but Dieter, we've heard about from things from metals to plastics to PCBs, right?
PCBs.
Yeah. I mean, all of those. And so, yeah, it is the number one.
It's a crisis.
Everybody's kind of, speculating when it might end. We've heard a variety of things from, second half next year into 2023, which means
people are mentioning every quarter, aren't they? Dieter, when you look at the impact on those businesses, I think you've said this before, it impacts the larger and the smaller companies differently. But when I talk to CEOs of EMS companies, there are a number of knock-on effects. There's stress in their relationship with their customers. There's a huge amount of inventory and work in progress that has its impact on cash. There's that stalling of growth and stalling of sales that Eric talked about. What's worrying people the most, and how different is the impact among different companies?
Well, at the moment, the saying is EMS is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And that is exactly the situation. People they have no overview what they're going to get. In regards to component, and that is making them in specific very nervous. They have been building up inventory, and they had already a lot of inventory. So in the first half of 2021, they didn't suffer that bad. They knew that the shortage was coming, but it actually just hit them in the third and some only in the fourth quarter. And now we are in the middle, in the eye of the storm. And it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse in the first quarter. It's eating up cash as well. At the same time, now all of a sudden, inventory levels are going down because there is nothing been fed into the stores anymore. And I think the worst is yet to come when people cannot generate revenues anymore because they don't have the parts. And then all of a sudden, the business is picking up again. And people realize that they're short of cash and don't know how to pay the invoices. So we are in a very tricky situation at the moment.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating, Dieter, because when I hear you talk about that, it feels like there's a whole lot of trends colliding. You talk about increased demand. We're seeing increased demand in Europe. We're seeing it in the US because of regionalization. You talk about the lack of cash in those businesses. To me, that's going to have an impact on the other trend we're seeing, which is this substantial industry consolidation. There are going to be companies that have a good business but are cash strapped and are going to need to look for partners. Do you see that industry consolidation pressure continuing and actually being increased by this problem? Dieter.
Well, number one, we have seen at least, and that my list is not complete, we have seen more than 20 transactions this year where companies have been acquired. And if I analyze those, 70% were acquisitions of an EMS company by another EMS company. And that is a pure consolidation. On the other hand, and that is interesting as well, we see 30% of transactions where private equity companies are jumping on the wagon and they are buying companies as they see an opportunity to make a lot of money because they know and understand that the EMS industry will continue to grow at a much higher pace as the OEM industry.
Yeah, because of the lack of outsourcing.
It's clear that size matters. It's clear that this is an active environment and lots of discussions around acquisitions. It was interesting to me too. I think 2 or 3 of the companies that we met with had made or are making acquisitions in the United States of small facilities. It's not just within the there's an expansion out into global markets. The Americas is clearly a target for some of those. It reminds me a bit about the way the United States was, the North American market was, 10 years ago or so in the last decade. relative to EMS. It feels that vibrant over here. And it's going to be an interesting few years ahead as this all comes together, as people are getting that. And this impacts, obviously, the material supply chain, too. Part of the desire is to get bigger, to get a little more power, to be able to go to suppliers and get materials. So
yeah, you're right, Eric. It does feel like big is beautiful at the moment, and it's driven by a number of factors. We talked about the regionalization, which is very tangible. You can see that happening, but that means that a lot of OEMs are looking for an EMS with a footprint in Asia, a footprint in Europe, and a footprint in the Americas. That's one size driver. There's a critical mass thing where you've got to have a critical mass to be at the table, both from a customer side and a supply side. So there definitely is that idea of chasing scale, isn't there, Dieter? Do you feel there's a sweet spot? Is it filling in the gap between number one and number two in Europe? Because there is a big gap, isn't there, between Zollner and the next largest. Do you see people coming into that space over the coming 12, 18 months?
What we see is that, and we have heard it from Rainer Koppitz on the IPC seminar in Tallinn in his presentations, that he's still looking at several companies which he's focusing on, and the M&A tour of Kartech is not over yet. So that's the one thing. The European number two, Scanfil, we talked with them on a video conference 2 weeks ago, and they are more like Zollner, very conservative company, but very stable as well. So it's difficult. I couldn't say it at the moment who is or what is going to happen within the next 2 years. I only can say that there is a lot of things happening. Regarding the regionalization, everybody we visited talked about that. And everybody said as well, it's not happening overnight. It's a process that has kicked off, and it takes between 6 and 18 months to bring products back. And it's not just that, for example, jobs that have been with an EMS in China are now being transferred to an EMS in Europe or in the United States. It is a thing where at the same time, for example, some companies are outsourcing, having had their own factories in China and now want to outsource the European demand in Europe. Or the other way around, we see companies who have been outsourcing products in China are now pulling it back and doing it in-house in their own factories. So there is an inshoring, insourcing as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've seen. Go on, Eric.
The term over here is local for local, right? So it's regionalization. And, that's always been, we've spoken about this before, the definitive strategy, I think, for the industry. And I think we're coming back to that. We spoke to several who, while they have facilities in China, the majority of that is for China-based customers. So there's not a lot of that bouncing it around. And there's clearly, I'm sure we'll get into this environmental concern that underlies that as well. And that these dispersed supply chains have.
Yeah, there's a lot of those agendas that come together. I do quite like making predictions. So, Dieter, I'm going to predict that by the end of 2022, there are at least 3 European EMS companies over $1 billion. So you can call me on that next year when we have this discussion. So I'm feeling bold.
Good for you. Hey, can I raise one of the interesting issues here? We're talking about the business for EMS, but it's all driven by OEM, right?
Yeah.
And there's a couple of definitive trends, I think, within the OEM community that are worth highlighting. One is that they're outsourcing more, right? It is clear. I think Dieter has given the number that he thinks that of the total available market for electronics manufacturing in Europe. I think I said 60%. He said, no, it's 62%. So it shows you how good his data is. 62%
is now outsourced.
No, it's insourced still. It's still
insourced. That's what I thought. So right, 38% outsourced.
Yeah. So and they're doing it more. And as we talk to companies, you hear that they're mostly they're growing business with existing customers. And that means we've been doing PCBA, now we're growing into these other services. And that's more of a thrust for EMS for their growth rather than winning new business. It's really growing with that. But interesting, along the line, you also have OEMs who are developing their own EMS divisions within their companies, right? Which again reminds me of what happened in the United States years ago, right? OEMs who have now this excess capacity, so they decide, oh, let's do EMS. Let's sell our excess capacity.
And that can quite often become a full-blown EMS, can't it? You get an OEM, starts to bring in some outsourcing business, that becomes larger. We've seen that happen before.
Absolutely. And I don't know, it's worked sometimes. It hasn't worked a lot of times. So let's see. Curious to see how that trend evolves over here. And then you also have some OEMs are divesting facilities to the EMS, which kind of speaks to that larger trend towards more outsourcing as well.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, isn't it? You talk about that 38% outsourced or 62% insourced, whichever side of it you want to look at. It's very much dynamically the other way in North America. So, you're closer to 2/3 outsourced. So it does offer a very substantial growth in the total available market in Europe. So,
which should support your prediction of 3 EMS over $1 billion.
See, you're going to remind me of that, aren't you? Every quarter, you're going to say they're not there yet, Phil. You got to keep going. So some of the things that I think are an impact of reshoring, and we'll talk a bit about sustainability, because as I look at the problems that exist in the world of logistics, and I look at sustainability in manufacturing and supply chain as an issue, I keep coming up with the same answer, and that's shorter supply chains. To me, that means regionalization. And we're not pushing stuff through the Suez Canal when the Suez Canal gets blocked. So there are all kinds of benefits to that. Are the people that you've been seeing talking about sustainability, are they concerned about CO2 emissions? I know Europe tends to be much more active in terms of legislation around that as well. What are you seeing with respect to that?
Dieter?
Well, yes, there is a lot of talking about it. And if I start with, for example, the PCB industry over here in Europe, we talked about that yesterday. Only 2.5% of the European demand for PCBs is being manufactured in Europe, and the actual demand for PCBs in Europe has a global share of about 10%. So 3/4 of the total demand is being fulfilled by companies from the Far East, and it is in the majority China. And it is very much worrying, because we see a lot of instability factors in the logistical supply chain, as you hear about power cuts in China, which all of a sudden lead to a situation where a factory can only open 15 days and has to remain shut for the other 15 days. You hear about ports being closed due to outbreak of COVID. You hear about container and container ship shortages. We just read about the situation that there was a new outbreak in China, and a lot of testing had to be done in China, and all of that is very much worrying, despite the situation between Taiwan and China, which is a very shaky situation. And the management of the industry is like a shy deer. They want to have a reliable, predictable situation which they can live with, and nobody likes situations that are unpredictable and which are cutting the supply chains, making it unpredictable. So That is at the moment the biggest worry. And people have started, for example, to talk about setting up a PCB factory in Eastern Europe. Probably Eric can talk about that.
Yeah. Let me, before I address that, I would say to your point, Phil, the supply chain security issue seems more driven by geopolitical and kind of moving rather than the environmental as the main thrust there. So environmental underlies it and they see the benefit of it, but there's also just the concern. Everybody,
it's just the geopolitical supply chain.
The geopolitical. You know, we had, I forget which one of the EMS we spoke to made a comment that their customers here in Germany, industrial customers, electronics isn't a huge part of the product, right? It's not their area of specialty. And have always historically had very good, steady growth. So they've become very comfortable with the fact that they're going to get what they need. And so all of a sudden with the pandemic, they aren't getting product and it's like, what's going on? Now they're all waking up to the fact that, there's issues with this. And so let's get in those kind of things, people want to get control and try to maintain it. So the move, and one of them said that the move out of, anything moving out of China, whether it be back to Europe, to the United States, or with other countries in Southeast Asia, is driven by the OEMs. This isn't the EMS making a decision saying, we're going to move this because we think it's better. It's truly, as kind of somebody said, we act on behalf of our customers.
Yeah.
And what's driving that. And so, but then there's the realization that we can move the production, but then we still have the supply chain. We have the packaging, PCBs, we have the components there. So I think this awakening is good. I think that to get back to a regionalization strategy, we need to migrate those back. In the United States, the PCB industry is
the same. It's been decimated.
I think here in Europe as well. And I think now, again, those take time, that takes investment. I think that's good for kind of public-private kind of collaboration around those things as well to kind of help really support the industry.
Yeah, I think that's essential. And I think what's interesting, and again, it's a whole bunch of dynamics playing together for those industries like the printed circuit board industry, but for other industries to be competitive in Europe and in the more expensive parts of Europe, we have to think about digital transformation. We have to think about automation. Are people looking to those areas? I've always seen Germany and actually other parts of Europe as being massively ahead of the curve in terms of automation. Is that something you've seen on your trip?
Absolutely. I mean, the automation and again, a lot of it is that post-reflow automation, right? Because the pre-reflow has always been fairly automated, or pretty much all automated. Now it's really the after. I mean, what we've seen has been, in a word, very impressive over here. So yeah, we can talk about digitalization after, but from an automation perspective, absolutely. The equipment sets, Dieter mentioned, that he saw ASM in so many. It's pretty clear too, that as you go into these, there's a lot of support the country kind of. So you go into a lot of German ones, you see a lot of German equipment manufacturers, right? And that shouldn't be surprising. That's a good thing. Dieter, what did you think on the automation?
Well, and I connect this with regionalization. When we see orders coming back, we're not just talking about high mix, low volume orders coming back. We're talking probably in the majority about high volume, low mix products, and you can combine that as well with the problem on labor shortage. So additional volume is coming back to Europe, and some companies already today have a huge problem to get the appropriate labor to do that. So that is getting a bigger problem, and in part you have to solve this problem with a higher degree of automation. And we have seen a lot of automation, which is good. I can tell you there is still a lot to be done, not only within the companies we saw. I think in general, we need a much faster flow of products through the factory. We need to see a lot of flow improvements, logistic flow improvements with, let's say, cellular manufacturing in multiple cells to assemble the product. And doing that, we can, in actual fact, get the throughput much faster. And with a faster throughput, we will be able to reduce the work in process, which as well is a capital binding issue. So all of that comes together. You cannot just look at it individually. And I can tell you, in every factory, I felt that there was too much product in manufacturing, and it should move faster through manufacturing. Speed over here, and that is similar to the semiconductor industry, which I remember 40 years ago, when I worked for IBM, the point was always, if a semiconductor runs through production too long, the yield is reducing. The faster you get the product through manufacturing, the higher the yields. And I think the faster you get your EMS products through manufacturing, the better your profits. And the better your capital situation and all of that. So I can only urge people to look into the logistics of their own factory much more.
Yeah, I think that automation of the way material is moved about is very important. And, interestingly, some of the factories that you've been visiting the last couple of weeks, I'd visited several years ago, and a few of them really stood out. I think BMK, very impressive in terms of the way they automate and the materials flow.
Digitalization, it's clear that the adoption and implementation really varies by company size, right? What does it? And I think that and there's really kind of the two areas. One is kind of on the shop floor, what they're doing, connecting it, gathering the data, putting the data and getting it into their MES systems. The challenge there, as we talk to companies, is then once you have the data and you have it, is how do you connect that with the workers and the people to turn it from data into actionable benefit where you can improve efficiency. And then we also hear about it on the other side, which is companies who are using it to improve their communication. So more on the business process side. So I forget which company it was telling us, just leveraging Microsoft Teams, how many meetings, how many hours, even they're doing texting through it. He says it has become the global most primary communication source. And it's just allowing so much more smoother and capturing of information and exchanges about things. So I would say, it varies is the answer. But it certainly is being used. We saw one company, very impressive. They were managing the test equipment in Asia from their facility in Germany. And so they had it all set up. They could go in and look at all the test fixtures that are being run in China, and they get alerts when there's a problem, and they could adjust it remotely from there. I mean, this is very impressive what they're doing out there. So.
And I think you're right, that digital transformation happens in a lot of departments, doesn't it? We've talked for years about Industry 4.0 and what it means on the factory floor, but it has to be the case in logistics. It has to be there throughout the supply chain, throughout the way HR is managed, throughout the way the business communicates. And we've had to be creative and innovative throughout the pandemic to deal with that. So that's become a big, important part of it. So Eric, you're flying home this afternoon. What are you going to be doing?
No, tomorrow.
Tomorrow. What are you going to be musing as your key takeaways from your trip to Europe? Apart from the fact Dieter is a wonderful host, we know that.
Well, I'll make a comment about that in a moment. But my key takeaway is that this is a very exciting time for the EMS industry in Europe. I mean, and all of these issues we're discussing all mesh together. It's hard to speak about any of them in isolation because they're all interwoven. The people I'm meeting are very impressive. The facilities I've been seeing are very impressive. I mean, world-class facilities. the business is here, right? And it seems like it'll be growing over here. And so I am, my takeaway is I want to come back soon and do more of this, because this is very valuable. Like Dieter said, he sits around at his computer and has phone calls, EMS. Now I do a lot of things from my desk as well. So coming out and touching the industry like this and talking to the people and getting a better sense of the themes and the issues and the challenges and the opportunities has been invaluable for me. So.
Yeah, and you make a very good point there about being near the consumer. Proximity to consumer really is hugely important, and that plays to that regional thing we talked about. Dieter, as you wave Eric off at the airport tomorrow, what are your takeaways from this trip?
Well, first of all, it has been very exhausting because we had more or less, even so some people might think, hey, we had a lot of fun. No, we did not have a lot of fun. We had a lot of work. We have been working 12 to 14 hours every day. So we visited companies at night. We were wrapping up the things. We were writing it all down. We were discussing for hours what can be done to improve the situation. See, this is not just about informing the society about the EMS industry. We have been discussing about how can we solve certain or help solve certain issues in this industry, and I think that has been very, very constructive. The discussions we had with Eric, we didn't always agree. We had heavy discussions as well about politics, and so it was a exhausting time, but I wouldn't want to miss it because I think we both learned a lot, and that will probably advance us further to serve the EMS industry better. Eric on a global scale, me still on the European scale, in order to give the industry reliable data and information. And hey, let me mention that is something where EMS Now is brilliant in. And I don't want to forget to mention that EMS Now has been just voted the best online news in the internet for the EMS industry, with the best content of all. And that is something where EMS Now is much more advanced than anybody else.
And I would like to thank Dieter for that award, by the way. That was anyway.
Danke, Herr Weiss. That was, that's very kind. Thank you so much, guys. You're probably going to go and have hopefully a more relaxing day today.
To all of the companies that opened their doors and allowed us in and had conversations with us, I'd like to thank you for that. For the companies we weren't able to go see, and some were reaching out while we were here, hopefully next time around we can do this. And Dieter, let's do this again soon.
Yes.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your time together, and we'll see you both soon. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.